I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thank you especially to those of you who've had a chance to recommend the show to somebody you think might like it. Please do so if you haven't yet had the chance. It does make a difference. Also, quick and less complicated call to action this week. If you listen to the show and you enjoy it, take a moment to let me know if there are any podcasts you subscribe to, that have extra episodes, or that you have whatever additional content in the horrible jargon of our times. If there are any podcasts you donate to or you subscribe through Patreon to, send me a note. Just let me know what those are, or maybe what you like about them, what they have going on. I would appreciate it. You can write to sleerickets@gmail.com. This week, I am speaking to Austin Allen. He's come back to the show. He has very generously agreed to answer some questions about his recent essay, Hardline Politics, in the Los Angeles Review of Books. It's a terrific essay. It's really worth reading. It is all about the long and bloody battle between free verse and formal verse. Austin has a lot of smart things to say about it, and when it came out, a lot of people were happy. A lot of mostly formal poets were very pleased and vindicated, and plenty of other people, some of them also formal poets, were pretty pissed off. I had a conversation with a couple of them, and I put out an invitation to all of you to send in questions or comments or objections about Austin's essay. Austin also got a couple of responses, and so he came in and we just sat down and we went through all of the objections, all of the problems, all of the quarrels that people had with his essay, and he handled this barrage quite gracefully. So I'm very grateful to him for being such a good sport. Austin is, in addition to being the author of this and a number of other excellent critical essays, he's also the author of Pleasures of the Game, a winner of the Anthony Hecht Prize some year, I don't remember, but it was recent. It's a terrific collection of poetry. So do check that out. I will have links to all of these in the show notes. But let's go ahead and get right to that conversation with Austin Allen now. You were very generous in agreeing to come onto the sort of blind firing squad.
The hot seat.
Yeah. So you have this essay that, it's I wouldn't say like necessarily like a pugilistic essay, but it takes up unlike a lot of writing about contemporary poetry, it has a very clear, specific argument, if not fight, that it's taking up. Do you want to give an abstract or a brief account?
Absolutely. So this is called Hardline Politics on the Myth of Free Verse. It's in the LA Review of Books, and it's talking about what I argue is a political stigma that has come to surround formal or metered verse as opposed to free verse. I see it as a myth. And, roughly speaking, the myth is that metrical verse is politically regressive unless proven otherwise. There's a kind of default conservatism to it that is political in nature, and that free verse is politically progressive unless proven otherwise.
And you talk about the ways in which it's a problem. I think you very smartly say it ends up being mostly innuendo rather than kind of overt stated prejudice. One of the objections I got in a couple of different forms was not that meter is in fact conservative or fascist or whatever, but that this stigma does not exist.
Yeah.
That was kind of the primary response.
That's a question. As you say, this essay is very long, and the LARB was very generous in giving me this much space. And I kind of set a word limit on myself after a certain point. I mean, this debate can go in so many different directions that there were some things I was not really able to include, and so there was only so much context that I did provide in the essay as to why this, why now. One thing I tried to do in the essay itself was throw out a few statistics, in terms of publication numbers. And of course, those could not be, perfect or exhaustive, but some representative statistics as to, whether formal verse is actually appearing in any, in any real quantity in major magazines, whether it's getting recognition at the level of grants, prizes, things like that. So I am very familiar with this idea that the debate was over kind of a generation ago. This is something I came across in some of my own research. I actually came across it again just the other day, a couple times actually. One in the poet Daniel Brown has written a short critical book called Subjects in Poetry. Briefly, he touches on this debate in this book and seems to sort of support the idea that these arguments, the so-called form wars of the 80s and 90s, that storm has subsided. I also had a email from an old friend, Emily Copley, who's a critic and who also has a really interesting book coming out called Virginia Woolf and Poetry. She wrote me because in the intro to her book, she makes the same kind of claim as well. Again, just sort of incidentally, but she was interested.
The claim being that it's sort of that battle has passed.
The battle has passed, yeah. And she was saying, I read your essay, I was interested in it and interested to see maybe in some ways it hasn't. On the level of publication numbers, there is still a huge, huge disparity in terms of formal versus free verse getting published. And this in a time when most major publications, programs, etc., say they're very much open to all forms, styles of poetry. It's very rare for a publication or institution to say, no, nothing in meter and rhyme.
I mean, it would be refreshing, honestly.
It would be
respect it.
Yeah, it would be transparent.
There are, there's like one or two that specifically say only meter and rhyme, and I mean those are quite rare. But there are a couple that have that explicit stipulation. I think like that's I would kind of like to see. I wish people made more specific demands about what they wanted to publish.
I think that transparency would be amazing, and I would welcome it and respect it. But long story short, I do use the word innuendo in the piece. So I have, on a sort of in personal exchanges and stuff, certainly come across this idea that fairly or unfairly, formal verse still has a conservative reputation, and I've heard that from friends who write primarily in free verse as well as form, and it does pop up. It does bubble up kind of in the discourse. I see on social media, or even I think there was at least one panel at the AWP conference some years back, sort of taking up this question of form and conservatism, and whether so-called form, meter and rhyme are still conservative, traditionalist, tethered to the kind of the canon, and the worship of the canon as in a kind of conservative way. So these ideas are still.
I'm sorry, real quick. Are you hearing a whistling sound?
Oh, that's my radiator. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. Good. That's fine. As long as it's not in my head. All right, go ahead.
No, you're not. You don't have like
winter in Boston. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So it doesn't get made as much these days in formal venues and settings, but it still does get made informally on social media, in conference panel discussions, that kind of thing.
I'll say my own experience is that it often takes. It's either innuendo or it's even not. If you put the formal prejudice to people who reveal it in their speech, I don't know that they would even recognize it. I don't know that they would even say it's not. I don't like in some cases. I think it's that it's being coyly suggested, and in others, I think they're not even aware that that's how they're thinking. But I think it's even present in. I mean, my kids' children's book about poetry. You pick it up, and it's like one of the very first things is, oh, well, poetry doesn't have to have rules. There's no rules in poetry. And you think, sure, that's fine, and that's true enough in a way, but also, what is that really getting at? Like if you were to ask, say, well, what would be an example of a rule that the very first example, of course, that would come to mind is, well, poetry doesn't have to rhyme. Like that would be, that's like rule number one that people like to make a point of saying does not exist. Even, I mean, what I find very telling is that the presence of a little bit of formal poetry is so startling to people that it can, like Sam Riviere in my conversation with him referred to the whole Christian Wyman period of poetry. He said, well, it was basically a new formalist magazine, which is fucking insane because it, like, they had a couple few formalists they published semi-regularly, Joshua Megan, A. Stallings, Wyman writes some free verse or some formal verse as well, but like, good Lord, like the overwhelming majority was free verse. And I think those little sorts of remarks about that will speak dismissively of traditional or establishment or rules. To me, I always find it hard to imagine what that could possibly mean if it didn't mean meter and rhyme. And I don't know that people are thinking of that, but I think it's in the way we talk casually about it.
Yes. Yeah. So no, I've encountered that too. I've noticed that, if whether it's a publication or some kind of poetry institution can be perceived as formalist just from the mere fact that they do not totally reject meter and rhyme, as opposed to any kind of predominance of meter and rhyme within publication or what have you. And I just as a little historical background here, I mean, these ideas go way back, and that's something that was clarified for me in researching this. I mean, when you look at even the way the earliest modernist free verse practitioners and proponents like Pound, like Eliot, the terms they use, they often use words like conservative verse for formal versus radical verse. And of course, as the essay gets into, Eliot and Pound themselves were hyper conservative. Pound went, trended very fascist as his life went on. So they were not political progressives or radicals in that sense, but they saw what they were doing as poetically and aesthetically radical. And so they often use those terms. And so I think just those terms alone sometimes get conflated in a slippery kind of way with political conservatism and political
it's certainly. And you make a point of saying that, like, if you examine some of the language and some of its origins, there were effectively radical propositions that Mussolini was making that were radical in the sense that they were sort of uprooting things and thoroughly.
And Pound became a great booster of Mussolini. So his idea of what was revolutionary and radical is not what a good leftist would think of.
Or a good human being. No, certainly. I'm a little bit curious because I think part of what contributed to this sense of free verse as progress or freeing or opening up, because that's often the other kind of language, is that there's a suggestion that if you really want to express yourself, if you really want to get to the authentic you have to break the shackles of meter and write in this other way. And part of what I think certainly contributes to that impression that people still have in some cases today. I've gotten comments like that about my own work. Like, well, when are you going to have your break where we really hear the real you break through in unrhymed lines that don't have meter? Part of what contributes to this is the trend of prominent, great 20th century poets who did make this shift in some way or another over the course of their careers. Which is true for a lot of representational and then later abstract or experimental painters as well. But Robert Van Warren, Robert Lowell, Bishop, Adrian Rich, Eliot himself, and pretty much any of the people who were writing free verse in the early or middle 20th century started out writing in formal meter because that was the dominant mode of the day. Do you have thoughts on that, or if there is anything to that suggestion? I don't know. I go back and forth about it.
I go back and forth in terms of my own practice, because anytime as a writer of poetry, a practitioner, you can easily find any one thing that you're doing, any one mode that you're writing in, exhausting or restrictive after a while, and want to do something else. So the idea of rhyme and meter specifically as being restrictive, Also goes back a way. So, as I was writing the essay, I sometimes thought of Keats's "If by dull rhymes our English must be chained." He does this in a sonnet. It's a sort of almost, he invokes the idea of rhyme being restrictive and then turns a beautiful sonnet anyway, kind of thing. And then in the 20th century, this of course becomes a huge thing. I do think I certainly understand, sympathize with. Sometimes I felt in my own practice the idea that formal techniques, meter and rhyme, can feel restrictive after a while, and that you want to do something else. And I certainly think, and I tried to discuss this in the essay, that when back in the day when meter and rhyme were expected and kind of demanded by the poetry market, that certainly felt restrictive. And so I tried to write with great sympathy about the mid 20th century kind of great poets, some of whom you mentioned, especially, who just felt that there was this expectation and this burden that, first of all, they came up at a time when what they would have studied or been taught as students of poetry was the canon, Milton and words, and a whole lot of pentameter and a whole lot of meter and rhyme and almost nothing but. And so I certainly understand why that felt restrictive. And back when the poetry market was kind of demanding that poets use those tools, it was a rebellious and in certain ways freeing move to explore new techniques and try new things and clear space for different kinds of poetry. And so nothing in this essay is meant to be nostalgic for an earlier period or want to turn back the clock on any of these things. I come from a position of wanting there to be as much going on at any one time in poetry in terms of forms and tools and verse styles and stuff as possible. So, I suppose that there may be people out there who simply, I don't know anyone in particular, but there may be people who simply do not like free verse and kind of wish the 60s had never happened, or the 20th century, and just want to take it all the way back to the Victorian era. And
there are those people.
I don't want to err in that direction, but and if the poetry market, if we woke up tomorrow and all the journals were publishing only meter and rhyme, that would be creepy, and that would seem like a weirdly regressive move.
Especially if they also said we accept all
poetry. And so what is considered conservative in poetry at any one time has a lot to do with what the market expects or demands, and so for some of those earlier generations, yes, definitely, it felt like there was a market expectation or a cultural expectation that they would use these forms and techniques, and good for them for breaking out of it.
Yeah, and there are, outside of a handful of often, very much paleoconservative, sort of self-consciously, classically inclined magazines and conversations, outside of a handful that sort of celebrate their own conservatism, it does seem like nobody wants to claim that, right? For him, like nobody wants to say, I am following a more staid and unexceptional and non-experimental tradition. I'm trying to follow only in others' footsteps. So I got so many of these little notes and things. In fact, I've been getting a bunch as we've been talking. I want to try to go through a few sort of the shorter, quicker objections or questions and see if we can knock some of those out. And then
like a lightning round.
Yeah, we can do like kind of a quick lightning round. And then I get some longer ones. And then I got a one from Cameron, my teenage prodigy in the UK. And then you got kind of a strange, interesting one that I would be interested to talk some more about. So no one claims meter's conservative anymore. The stats seem cherry picked, which I think is more true of some than others. Like you make one comment about sort of the prizes and where those have gone, and that seems pretty hard to argue with. That it's something like 3 out of 118 prizes over the last several years that have gone to somebody who writes in meter. And then I was curious why you sort of plucked the handful of the KR Online, for the Kenyon Review Online, and the poetry, you sort of pulled up a couple exemplary issues, but then I wasn't sure why it was those and not others, or sort of to what extent these were exemplary.
Yeah. So in terms of the data, lest I be accused of cherry picking, I mean, I would encourage folks to sort of run their own numbers.
Yeah.
One reason I kept it to 2 magazines, for example, and 2 very prestigious magazines, is I don't love doing call outs, in my critical work or on the internet, or I mean, they're to be avoided if possible. I was not looking to put a bunch of magazines in the hot seat. I took 2 that are consistently ranked among the top. There are literary magazine rankings out there, and they consistently kind of rank in the top 3 or 5, and just sort of giving a glimpse of how over a 4 to 5 year period, very little was changing in terms of their publication numbers. But I think what I found in those cases, I think if people kind of do the math themselves, I think that they will find that is broadly true of most of the prestigious literary journals out there, that there won't be too much variation. I want to say too that in terms of the prizes, I did get I said 3 out of 118. I did get a couple notes from poets, one of whom said I'm a formalist, and I won one of those awards. I think I don't think there's a confidentiality thing attached to this. It's Shane McRae pointed out that he has won a Whiting Award within the past 10 to 20 years, and also some other big awards and grants.
And he was a rare example of. I mean, I would love to see another trend of somebody who wrote more in free verse and has become more formal as he's gone along.
That's right.
He also, I'll say, his poems, because of their typographical representation on the page, I think sometimes readers miss that they're formal.
He did mention that.
Yeah.
And another poet was Jennifer Clarvo, who again said, in writing me that she writes both free and formal verse, and that I simply hadn't taken into account some of the formal verse she's written. So I'm happy to sort of update that stat. Maybe it may be 5 rather than 3 out of 118. But I don't think, and I maybe if I was wrong in a couple other cases, I just don't think the numerator is going to move around too much there.
But I think that makes sense. You look, go look up some other popular magazines and see what the numbers turn out to be, because I think the trend will hold even if the particulars vary.
I think that's right.
All right, let's see. Too long didn't read is the most common response, which is sort of, it's like you're thankless because it's like it's so long and thorough because you're trying to cover your bases. Oh, okay. So I did hear that it was unfair to editors because editors don't actually have a bias. That I think and this is something that it's one of the problems with statistics, that you might be able to look at a larger field and say, well, this is the trend statistically. But an individual editor can still say, "Hey, well, I have no prejudice. I have nothing against form. I don't discriminate," and that's hard to argue with. I mean, and because the stakes are so much different than they are, or so much lower, I should say, than they are with other forms of discrimination you might highlight. It's who would want to pick you go in peace, editors. You are absolved.
Yeah, on that point, I should probably point out that nowhere in the essay or in my own life ever would I say that this is discrimination in some sort of traditional legal sense. Formalist poets are not a historically oppressed or marginalized group. No. This is all lower stakes than that. We're just sort of talking.
Let me quickly get my air conditioning. Okay, sorry about that. So you were comparing yourself to Martin Luther King and saying that formal poets are an oppressed class. Is that what I heard you through the air conditioner?
I think I was doing the exact opposite. This is in no way when we talk about editors not taking much formal poetry. No, we're not talking about discrimination in any kind of this high stakes sense, or that free verse poets or formal poets are historically oppressed or marginalized. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's it's a work of criticism that takes a kind of writing that gives me a lot of pleasure and joy, which is metrical poetry, and tries to argue for its value and kind of clear space for more of it to be published and appreciated. But no, I am not, for example, saying that journals should or must publish a certain quantity or quota of any one kind of poetry, and certainly editors have the right to their own tastes and preferences.
Yeah, you're not nominating yourself to chair a board to oversee formalist affirmative action. Yeah. So then a related objection that I heard that I think has something to it is that whether or not this belief or prejudice about meter and politics held in the past and maybe has a residue today, the reason that metrical poetry isn't published as much is not that anybody has any kind of ideological objection to it, but just that it's out of fashion.
It may be true that in some sense that there is now an audience a somewhat greater audience preference for free verse. That's actually hard to establish or prove for a lot of reasons. For example, in terms of most people most readers and critics and judges of poetry are themselves poets. It's a somewhat insular world. And as I definitely do say in the essay, when we're talking about the poetry market, it's a heavily gatekept market. It's an artificial market in certain respects. It is not a open, free market competition. Very little in America is, by the way. But the poetry market is a strange, small, insular world. And I touch on a little bit of the fact that, for example, there is a sort of system of licensure in poetry where credentials and that people can pick up in various ways. There is also, many publications I would point out solicit a lot of their work. So they're not necessarily choosing what they publish always on the basis of some kind of popular demand. And the ways that we have to measure actual popular demand for poetry are, first of all, imperfect. Second of all, I've never seen anybody who claims affirmatively that free verse is more popular than formal poetry supply any kind of data on this at all.
Other than the kind of data that you're providing, right? Like it's more popular, by virtue of getting published more. Right?
Yes, or getting more awards. But I guess I'm getting at that those kind of metrics are not operating in a totally free market.
Poetry is pretty on the far end of not being a meritocracy as the spectrum goes. I think it's like if sports are kind of close to the other end, poetry's maybe down on this one.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing I would say is that whenever I've encountered any kind of glimpse into some kind of numbers here, I mean, one thing would be social media, right? Poets share poems on social media, free verse poets, formalist poets, prose poets, everybody shares their work at this point. And that provides a little window of transparency because, social media comes with little metrics of how how popular you are. It's kind of a popularity game in some ways. And, I've seen, from just sort of observing social media that sometimes the formal poems get a lot of attention and gain popularity. Sometimes free verse poems do. There are a lot of poems that people share that just get some interest and attention from friends, and that's it. I have no sort of evidence in hand, and I don't think anybody does, that free verse poetry is outperforming formal poetry in that way. I guess the other number you could bring in would be book sales, but there too, those are not frequently reported on in poetry. They're very low for almost everybody.
Yeah.
So anytime you kind of try and bring numbers in to prove that somehow free verse is more popular, I think that's a very hard case to make from that end.
So so a related objection maybe is that I'm trying to here. I have it put. He says there aren't many metrical poems being published, but that could just be that the metrical poems are crap. If the first part is to prove significant, he needs to show that the magazines are failing to publish good poems in meter. I mean, I assume there are proportional numbers of good formal poems, but the argument would require you to make this case. I think the suggestion being maybe that because free verse poetry became dominant for whatever reason, at this point, it is dominant. And then, therefore, most people who have an inclination to write poetry are writing that kind of poetry. And so if a good poet is 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 50,000 or whatever, and you have a million free verse poets, you're going to have more good poets in that group. So that's maybe one response, that it, like, maybe there was a historic, and this is like YG Ma has a really good essay in Slate from a while ago about female chess players and why there's never been a female world champion. And it's this same reason, that they're for other shitty reasons, women were not playing chess as much. And so there are fewer chess players. And so there are fewer great female chess players. And so I think there's an argument to be made that, I mean, Darwin talks about this with, like, once a variety of a species becomes dominant, it tends to become more dominant. And once a variety becomes rare, it tends to become more rare. Granted that we're not eating and killing each other literally at this point, but
right, I would reject the notion that I keep, by the way, I hate the term formal poetry, as I say.
I know.
Metrical poetry.
Yeah, right.
That metrical poetry has simply vanished due to some sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest thing. No, I don't think that's right. And I would say that that is another area where the essay couldn't do as much as, say, a book would or something. But I do believe, long story short, that metrical poetry is, despite the kind of market factors against it, still being written at a very high level by a good number of poets. And some of those poets I've boosted, and recommended in other settings, other criticism on social media. I would be happy to, rattle off a list of names here if you want. Matthew Buckley Smith, everybody should buy.
I think we can all agree.
But no, this argument would not. It's true, and it's a very smart and good question. Like, this argument wouldn't be worth making if I didn't think that there were a significant number of poets writing using the tools of meter and rhyme at a very high level and doing excellent work that is underappreciated.
Yeah, that seems right. I mean, a related objection, or maybe a complementary objection I got was, if you care so much about this, why, instead of writing this, and this is maybe a sort of a larger question about the essay, but instead of writing this essay picking this fight, why wouldn't you just write an essay promoting the work of some good formal poets or some good metrical poets?
Excellent question, and I am doing that very thing. I'm about to start a review of 3 younger formalist poets whose work has come to my attention either through my own reading or because they sent me a review or galley copies of their books within the past year or two. These are 3 books I really enjoyed. I don't know. I think I should let the review come out before I talk too much. But long story short, I am about to review and recommend 3 brand new books by younger formalist poets that I really, really enjoy.
Terrific. Yeah. I mean, I do think that probably any given essay can only be one essay, and it can't do all things. So I'll read a typically learned and nuanced short essay form question from Cameron, who's a student at Oxford University. He says, I noticed that the essay mostly I'm sorry, I say he, I actually don't know if it, I always fuck up the pronouns. I don't know. But Cameron says, I noticed that the essay mostly restricts itself to Anglo-American poets, not, for instance, delving into the metrical practices in the Caribbean. That may well be because of space and word count limitations. Yeah, why wasn't this long? Why wasn't this too long essay longer? Oh, so when we say fairly, Cameron says, so I thought I'd ask whether Austin might be interested in sharing his thoughts on Caribbean poets' approaches to meter. I'm thinking especially of Derek Walcott and Kamau Brathwaite, who seem to me to embody different approaches to the master's house and master's tools debate. Walcott repurposing the tools, the loose items of the language used by the colonizers, the language he loves, and Brathwaite, meanwhile, declaiming that the hurricane does not rage in iambic pentameter. I did not know Kamau Brathwaite until I saw his name here and had to look him up. Walcott obviously is terrific, but yeah, I'm curious if you actually have a PhD in this shit, so maybe you know more than I do. So yeah, you have any thoughts?
I do, and I know better than to do off the cuff quick take. It's an excellent question, and the poets Cameron mentioned are absolutely well worth looking into. I don't want to freestyle criticism of anybody's poetry, which is also why a minute ago I tried not to talk too much about the review that I'm doing, because I'm just too afraid of kind of doing somebody an injustice by speaking off the cuff.
I will sort of shift this then slightly to, you sent me a question that you got, and both that and this one touch on the question of politics, and you do talk in your essay at some length about not just the use of free verse or formal verse in political contexts, but specifically in sort of traditions within traditions or counter traditions within traditions, whether it's Black Americans writing with a kind of a what I guess it would be another version of the Du Bois, double consciousness. I think it was Marilyn Nelson who talked about, my people's songs versus the master's, meter, but she sort of refused to fully embrace or let go of either, and preferred to make use of both. You got an email about Claudia Rankine. Would you read that for us?
Yes, I'd be glad to. So this one, I put out a call for anybody who might want to send in a question. And this was the question I got sent. I was curious, what do you think is the effect of Claudia Rankine's free verse in a work like Citizen or Just Us? I heard Simon Armitage, the British poet laureate, criticize the subtitle of Citizen, which is an American lyric, because he didn't see how it could be considered a lyric in one of his Oxford lectures. Is there a sense in which a prose poem can be more political, whether progressively or regressively or whatever, in America at present, considering how much more open the general public seems to approaching prose as opposed to metered poetry? I guess I'm suggesting or asking, does prose poetry speak more directly to a larger audience than verse does today? I think I spoke to this a little bit when I said that it's remarkably hard to tell in terms of numbers what the quote unquote general public prefers or doesn't prefer in terms of poetry. Specifically, first of all, in terms of Simon Armitage's criticism of the subtitle of Rankine's book, I have to say I disagree with that, and I don't really like or do the critical move where you try and set boundaries on what a poem is or isn't, or what a lyric is or isn't. Because that's just asking. It's sort of rules are made to be broken in the arts, and that's just asking for somebody to prove you wrong. Of course, Rankine's Citizen, for example, it's a hybrid text. I mean, it contains both prose and verse.
I mean, it is. It's overwhelmingly prose, though.
It is overwhelmingly prose, but it contains some.
Yeah, as well as a bunch of pictures. I mean, it's sort of a collage.
That's right. That's right. And so those kind of, first of all, those kind of experiments, formal experiments, are fascinating to me. Prose poetry, I have a great affection for prose poetry. Personally, I've tried writing some of it myself in the last couple of years. I teach it, when I've taught, I have taught a fair amount of it. And so I certainly think prose poetry can be lyric and can be poetry. That's not even a question to me. But it is very hard to say what the public preference is, and whether the seeming popularity of prose poetry in the case Rankin's book, which I understand was a very, had good sales numbers and became very popular and gained a lot of visibility. I'm not sure if that can be taken as that one book can be taken as an instance of a larger trend. I don't know, in other words, whether prose poetry speaks more directly to a larger audience than verse does. Maybe so, but I don't think popularity in that sense is first of all the main arbiter of quality anyway. And there are a lot of decisions and kind of gatekeeping stuff that goes into what the general public sees in magazines or coming out of book presses anyway. So it's just hard to say. It's kind of an unanswerable question, although a very interesting question.
Yeah, well, and the related question, which is sort of, it's almost buried in both of these, both this and Cameron's, is there a sense in which a prose poem can be more political? And then Cameron's, I think the framing is the question sort of refers to the master's tools and master's house debate, which is, was that Audre Lorde, or was she quoting somebody when she said it?
That was Audre Lorde.
Yeah, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, or something close to that.
Right.
Which is, I don't know, it's always seemed to me a dubious claim. But I mean, in both cases, there's almost an implication that we're taking it as a given that poetry either can be political or can affect politics, can affect some political change. And you talk so much in your, I mean, if there is a a very simple moral to take from your essay, it would be metrical form is independent of politics. Those things don't have no direct relationship one to the other.
Sure.
But I'm curious for you, both in this specific context and more broadly, because you're somebody you're very into poetry and very into politics. I'm curious, how do you think about poetry as a political object or act, or act of participation?
That is a very good question. So yes, I am very very interested, if not obsessed, with both. And the political relevance or value of poetry is a huge subject in and of itself. I mean, that is another book-length subject in itself, and something that I've touched on, I think, in some previous essays that I've written. But anybody probably listening to this show will know some of the touchstones here, right? Like Auden famously saying poetry makes nothing happen. Sure. Although Auden was very, very much a political poet in a lot of ways. And that quote is often taken out of context because later in the same passage, he says poetry is a way of happening, but that becomes a touchstone. William Carlos Williams saying, it is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Adrienne Rich is a touchstone here, and I think anybody, she or Audre Lorde or June Jordan were poets of that generation who first of all are still widely read and looked up to today, and second of all were extremely political in their work. I would point to careers of poets like that as kind of a refutation of the idea that poetry has no political impact or could have no political impact. I think they had a huge cultural impact, although poetry's impact is usually of a slow burn kind of nature. So it's not as if, they did their work or gave their lectures or what have you, and instantly, the whole culture was buzzing and changed overnight. It's just not like that. And there is a good Adrienne Rich quote about this where she, and I can't quote it perfectly, but she uses a metaphor that's something like poetry is an underground aquifer that wears away stone, so that it's this kind of underground or subsurface cultural force that over time has a slow kind of impact. And I believe that can be true, that poetry can have a political impact that is not necessarily immediate, or is going to make the newspapers overnight or anything like that, but over time through its impact on readers who take that reading into their own writing or their own lives, that it can be impactful politically.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's hard to claim that like X can never have an effect on Y. And, I think certainly over time and in rare cases, and who knows, yeah, sure, it can have this effect or that effect. I am super skeptical of political agendas or projects among writers of poetry. And I'm curious for you, as somebody who is pretty passionate about both, do you ever see do you ever sort of set out to perform a political act by way of or in your poems, or do you allow one to be a relief from the other? Or even if that's your tool, if you want to affect political change and you choose to write poetry, how good a plan is that?
Oh, yeah. Maybe not so great. There's Kenneth Burke, the literary critic. I came across a quote, and I can't cite a source for this, but I came across it recently, and it made me laugh, and it stuck in my mind. It was by Kenneth Burke, who was a literary critic, who was apparently writing about this topic: poetry, activist poetry, and the potential impact of activist poetry. And he wasn't against it, but he said one cannot recommend poetry as a cure for toothache without disclosing the superiority of dentistry. And I think that's kind of how I feel that poetry absolutely, I mean, first of all, it can't help being political, because in a certain sense, everything is, and certainly can have a political impact, especially in the longer term. But in terms of directly changing world events, I think you want to go with more direct forms of activism 99 times out of 100. Although there are poets like Rich or Lord who have made those two elements of their career, who have kept those in balance and been both, impactful poets and activists. And sometimes those two can meet in really fruitful ways in their projects. But I think I wouldn't recommend, to a group, if I were speaking to a group of activists that were looking to make an immediate, overnight change in Congress or something like that, I'm not sure the first thing I would recommend would be to write a poem.
Yeah, I'm supremely cynical about some of this stuff. I think that especially among progressives and leftists, who are, for the most part, who you're talking about when you're talking about poets, there's such an impulse to spend one's time fussing over language, which is not to say that language never matters, not to say that language can't make a big difference in people's lives, and not to say that there aren't parts of language worth fussing over at great length, as I spend most of my time doing. But in the context of political activism, I think progressives and leftists have a tendency to bicker about word choice rather than take a more difficult and more direct action, if that makes sense. And poetry provides sort of another vehicle for doing that.
Auden, toward the end of his life, when he was asked about this stuff, tended to take the stance that the most meaningful political act that poets make is just taking care of language, using language in an honest and in the broadest sense responsible way. And I think there's something to that. There is I certainly think that poets in general are, or at least are supposed to be, concerned with language's integrity, in a broad sense, language's potential to do good or do harm, and trying to use it in ways that do not do harm. And so, and that is something that, for example, politicians very much do not do most of the time. Most politicians are very sloppy users of language, sometimes very manipulative users of language. And so just by treating language with care, I think poets are doing something in a small way political and politically meaningful, even if, again, there's not an overnight kind of impact.
Yeah, I can live with that.
Do you disagree? Do you disagree?
Well, no, I mean, I guess I think of the writing of poetry as being just way more amoral. And I also think that the language clearly changes over time, and that's always been the case and always will be the case. And I'm fascinated by certain developments in language. I love slang I tend to love slang and innovations in language when they create opportunities for new ways of meaning and new distinctions, new specifications. I am less excited about change, whether it's inevitable or not, when it is either a shutting down of distinctions, as with the classic example of infer and imply slowly coming to mean the same thing, which maybe that's inevitable. Maybe that's the kind of thing that always happens. It doesn't thrill me as a development. And then the other kind of change I'm very cynical about is a change in language. And this is something I think politicians do participate in, the change that is meant to purify the moral condition of the language. And while, as with like the Simon Armitage claim about the lyric, it just seems like, what are you picking this fight for? Like, why are you bothering to say this thing? And I have that book of his lectures that I'm going to read. So I'm curious to see that in context, if it is interesting. Because I've liked a lot of his poems. I haven't read any of his criticism. So I always hesitate to like pick fights over like a particular change in the language that somebody feels a personal attachment to, because I don't want to pick fights with people over that stuff. But I also just think that any language is made up of history, and history is just soaked in blood. And so I think the idea that we can make sure that our language is in some way pure or moral is just it's never ending, and it's sort of a fool's errand. And I think sometimes we spin our wheels looking for new ways to tidy up the language rather than making somebody's life better in a more concrete way. That's my cynical assessment.
Oh, I agree with that. And I should make clear, I wasn't really talking about policing language or purifying it to some higher, perfect, holy state. I agree that that's not possible. When I'm talking about integrity, I'm talking more about the kind of thing that we mean when we say that a poem has no false notes in it.
Right.
That I was talking more about that kind of thing, and keeping language, in some sort of pure perfect state or working order. Yeah.
But by that standard, I think politicians definitely score poorly, because the false note is what rings out most of all. I've never any of them speak. Yeah, even the ones one sort of likes.
Yeah.
Oh God. I'm my sort of my other larger thought about this whole essay is, there are certainly like provocative pieces of art that people will say, hey, it got us talking, so I guess it did its job. And I think when it comes to pieces of art, I don't think that is always a mark of success. I think just because it got people talking, Piss Christ was not necessarily a work of genius. But I think for a critical essay, that is a pretty good standard. I think like if this provokes a bunch of arguments about either how it could have been done better or how various claims you make within it are true or false to what degree, that's pretty good. And it is a provocative and engaging essay. I think again, anybody who has a passing interest in the field will find it worthwhile.
Thank you. And
so thank you for doing it, because I also know it's a lot of work to do something like this. And as soon as you publish it, people like me start saying, hey, here's some objections.
You can never anticipate or defeat all objections, but nor can I settle this debate in any way. I do hope that it starts a conversation and is provocative in a good way, but I cannot lay down the law here. I cannot settle the debate once and for all. I can only get people talking.
And do let me know when your triple review is coming out.
Absolutely.
Do you want to name? I was going to say whether it's one of those poets or somebody else. Do you want to give a recommendation of something you've enjoyed reading or is worthwhile or good, something to make us feel not totally cynical and pessimistic about poetry or writing?
Yes. First of all, I will say the poets that I'm about to review: Armin Davoudian, Alexis Sears, and Boris Dralyuk.
Oh,
Um,
shit. Okay.
yeah,
All right.
and as far as other reading, I hope I'm not, saying this too early, but because I'm still working on it, and it may be a little while before it comes out. But this is a total left turn away from formalism. I'm working on an essay about Yoko Ono and
Oh,
her book Grapefruit from the 60s, which is a book of poetry and performance pieces and drawings from the kind of 60s, 70s era that I have loved for a long time. And because this new Beatles documentary came out and people are
right.
kind of talking about the Beatles and Yoko Ono again, I thought it would be a fun time to revisit that book, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah. It's I guess what you would, I don't know, would you call it a self-styled experimental avant-garde? I mean, is it,
Yeah,
okay, all right.
yeah.
Because that was her mode in most things.
It is. It is both experimental avant-garde and a very, very funny book. And so,
That never hurts. Good. Yeah. Well, I look forward to that and to all of those. And I'll have to say, I'm going to have to pick on her a little bit. But Alexis, if you hear this, let's set up that fucking interview. We've been going back and forth a little bit. But she's terrific. As
yeah.
I know her work and I know Armin's work, and they're both terrific. I don't the third one you named, Boris
Dralyuk, whose book is My Hollywood.
Okay.
And Alexis's book that's coming out soon is Out of Order. And Armin's book, which has already come, it's a chapbook called Swan Song.
That was my conversation with Austin Allen. You can find his essay Hardline Politics in the LA Review of Books. I will, of course, include a link to that as well as his book, Pleasures of the Game. I realized I've had Austin come on now a couple times to make great use of his Yale-educated, PhD-holding, nerdy poetry brain. And I don't want to give you the wrong impression about him, because he is, of course, a poetry nerd, but he's more than just an expert. So I thought I would close this week by reading one of his poems. This is probably my favorite poem from his book. It's called The Order of Her Room. I'll just read it quickly and then maybe say a word and sign off. This is The Order of Her Room. This one it's about 2 pages, but they're sort of short lines, short stanzas. Buddhism it was not. Maybe it was, a bit. Maybe the opposite, which nonetheless contained the part that she'd been taught, and from which we abstained. We didn't live in sin. We didn't share the lease or any special rights, except eating, most nights, from a Vietnamese or Thai food tin, or the same cereal bowl with separate spoons. Maybe part Buddhism, and on the whole, not bad. Half nudism some afternoons. Her towels hung as drapes, plain pink or striped, screening us from the street, rooftops, and fire escapes. In Sunday summer heat, we sat topless and typed. Although it was her space, I lingered in it more. Days when I worked from home, her home, I sat in place and watched her go and come, bone-tired through the door. My radiologist in training. She would fall asleep after her call, still wearing her white robe as I lay close and kissed the flesh of one earlobe. Unpierced and simple. After her virtuous nap, she'd rise and wash, re-enter with panache in a pink towel wimple that dripped in her lap, as she sat down and tried to work, with me beside, and just the towel on. So I angled to play, wanted, like some charged ray, to be absorbed, indrawn, and find, well, what? What is the body's center? Can it be reached or not? How shall the seeker enter? Quizzing her flesh and bone, I hardly knew my own, until I passed, somehow, beyond the window pane, out to the fire escape, from which I peer back now. Striped towel, undrape the radiance of that scene. We sit in our bare skin, crossing our legs, and read and write. Our knees may touch a little, but not much. If we have any need at all, we'll order in. So I like so much about this poem. It is I think it is less straightforward than it appears to be. It's a memory poem. It's a nostalgic poem about living with an old girlfriend in school, and sounds like she's on call. It sounds like she's a resident. I believe she's my radiologist in training. Right. If she were in medical school, she wouldn't be a radiologist in training yet. She'd just be a medical student. So yeah, this would have been her residency. I've also lived with a woman during residency. It is during her residency. It's not always picturesque. But this is a pretty attractive vision of it. And so, there are a number of poems that this poem gives a nod to. Among them, Adrian Rich's "Living in Sin," terrific little domestic poem. Of course, one can't help but hear the women come and go when we watch her go and come, bone tired through the door here from Prufrock. And I think also of A. Stallings' wonderful poem, Lovejoy Street, the house where we were happy, begins. As well as the very strange and understated but sort of ultimately devastating short story, The Thistles in Sweden, by William Maxwell. I think, like some of those poems, but maybe in a sort of a way that's a little quieter than the poems, which probably is closer to the Maxwell story, The Order of Her Room doesn't. It gets most of its tension, I think, its emotional tension. It's Warren irony from an implied change. In the midst of all this, radiology metaphor, this kind of a Dunnian flight of metaphor. What is the body center? Can it be reached or not? How shall the seeker enter? Quizzing her flesh and bone, I hardly knew my own. He's talking about a radiologist, and of course, in radiology, one sends particles passing clear through other particles as if they weren't there at all. And that's, of course, what happens to the speaker until I passed somehow beyond the window pane. He's speaking about this closed, insular, sometimes claustrophobic, highly intimate world, what Vonnegut called a nation of two. And he finds himself outside of it. Striped towel undrape the radiance of that scene. That rings a bell. I can't quite place it, but I'm sure Austen has some older poem in mind. What is that? There's a little bit of what light through yonder window breaks. It is the east and Juliet is the sun, but there's something else there. Striped towel undrape the radiance of that scene. There's some other poem there. I can't quite smell it. Or I smell it, but I can't quite name it. And then we have that wonderful return to the present. This present that we have not actually inhabited in the poem at all so far. But as with Pinter's betrayal, we end the story at the beginning with no sense of conflict at all, in the unremarkable, immediate, initial present, which is, of course, taken entirely for granted. We sit in our bare skin, crossing our legs, and read and write. Our knees may touch a little, but not much. If we have any need at all, we'll order in. I know the other poem. This is not the towel, but the other poem that last stanza reminds me of is Mary Jo Salter's really wonderful and sort of sad and sexy poem, Bed of Letters, from her book Nothing by Design. But yeah, this one is Order of Her Room. This is one I've come back to again and again. I'm going to read, it's a little longer than some, but I'm going to go ahead and read it again just because I think it's worth hearing. You, of course, are listening to a fucking podcast, so if you want to, you can turn it off. But I recommend you let this play out because it's a good poem and worth hearing at least twice. This is The Order of Her Room by Austin Allen. Buddhism it was not. Maybe it was, a bit. Maybe the opposite, which nonetheless contained the part that she'd been taught, and from which we abstained. We didn't live in sin. We didn't share the lease, or any special rights, except eating, most nights, from a Vietnamese or Thai food tin, or the same cereal bowl with separate spoons. Maybe part Buddhism, and on the whole not bad. Half nudism some afternoons. Her towels hung as drapes, plain pink or striped, screening us from the street, rooftops and fire escapes. In Sunday summer heat we sat topless and typed. Although it was her space, I lingered in it more. Days when I worked from home, her home, I sat in place and watched her go and come bone-tired through the door. My radiologist in training. She would fall asleep after her call, still wearing her white robe, as I lay close and kissed the flesh of one earlobe. Unpierced and simple. After her virtuous nap, she'd rise and wash, re-enter with panache in a pink towel wimple that dripped in her lap as she sat down and tried to work, with me beside, and just the towel on. So I angled to play, wanted like some charged ray to be absorbed, indrawn, and find, well, what? What is the body's center? Can it be reached or not? How shall the seeker enter? Quizzing her flesh and bone, I hardly knew my own. Until I passed somehow beyond the window pane, out to the fire escape from which I peer back now. Striped towel, undrape the radiance of that scene. We sit in our bare skin, crossing our legs, and read and write. Our knees may touch a little, but not much. If we have any need at all, we'll order in. Just one more note. The line I catch on every time I read it, and I marvel at a little bit. Right almost in the middle of the poem. Unpierced and simple. He says, my radiologist in training, she would fall asleep after her call, still wearing her white robe as I lay close and kissed the flesh of one earlobe. Unpierced and simple. It's a poem with mostly sort of long sentences that take up multiple lines. But he describes this pause, this brief moment, kissing an earlobe, a single earlobe, and then the line unpierced and simple it's a whole foot short. This is a trimeter poem, and that's a dimeter line, just 2 feet, unpierced and simple. But both of those words, set off with a period at either end, both of those words seem to suit the abbreviation. And there's a wonderful Baudelaire poem, Invitation to the Voyage, that Wilbur translates particularly well, in which all of the anguish, all of the sorrow, all of the pain that is so present in so much of Baudelaire's poetry is left off stage. But the poem is not cloying because one knows it's there out. One knows it's there, and it has been suspended only for the duration of the poem, and that feels like the case here. It is a memory that retains, if not a purity, then a good cheer and a fondness, even if somewhere outside its brackets there was some real loss. Anyway, that was The Order of Her Room by Austin Allen, and this is Slee Ricketts. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleericketts@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.